March 25th, 1975, began as a typical Tuesday in Kensington, Maryland. It was the second day of the spring school holidays, and for 12-year-old Sheila Lyon and her 10-year-old sister Katherine, affectionately known as Kate, the day was supposed to be a simple adventure. They were excited, just days away from celebrating their 13th and 11th birthdays. The girls lived in a tightly knit, upper-middle-class neighborhood where children still roamed free. Their father, John Lyon, was a well-known local radio personality, a voice the community trusted every day. Their mother, Mary, was the center of a warm, bustling home. When the sisters asked to walk the half-mile from their house to the Wheaton Plaza shopping mall for lunch, there was no reason to say no. But as the sun began to dip toward the horizon that evening, the comfort of that suburban innocence began to fracture. By the time the clock struck 7 o'clock, a mystery had begun that would haunt Maryland for over 40 years. It was a case that would involve thousands of hours of investigation, a tape recorder man, a family conspiracy, and a remote mountain in Virginia that held secrets too gruesome to imagine. Today, we dive deep into the abduction and murder of the Lyon sisters, a case that was cold for decades until a single pockmarked face in an old file changed everything. This is the evidence locker. Even though the bodies of the sisters have not officially been recovered, I am including this as a Solved Saturday episode due to the belief that the bodies were destroyed, along with the evidence that supports this. Disclaimer: there is mention of child sexual abuse as well as the murder of children. I will not go into any unnecessary detail, but please listen with care. To understand the gravity of what happened on March 25th, 1975, you first have to understand Kensington, Maryland, in the mid-70s. It was a place where the American dream felt firmly anchored in the red clay of the Chesapeake region. It was a world of station wagons, unlocked front doors, and free-range childhoods. In Kensington, parents didn't just trust their neighbors, they trusted the very air they breathed. John and Mary Lyon were the embodiment of this suburban ideal. John was more than just a father. He was a household name, a popular radio personality at WMAL. His voice was the soundtrack to the morning commute for thousands of Washingtonians. Mary was the heart of the home on Pliers Mill Road, managing a lively household of 4 children: 15-year-old Jay, 12-year-old Sheila, 10-year-old Katherine, known as Kate, and 9-year-old Joseph. This particular Tuesday morning was the second day of the school's spring vacation. It was a crisp, clear day. The girls were in high spirits, not just because school was out, but because they were on the cusp of major milestones. Sheila was going to turn 13 on March 30th. Kate would turn 11 on the 29th. They were days away from becoming a teenager and a tween, and their parents had already promised them a special birthday meal. Around 11 a.m., the girls approached Mary with a plan. They wanted to walk to the Wheaton Plaza shopping center, a massive, bustling hub only half a mile from their front door. They wanted to see the Easter exhibits, maybe browse the latest records, and just be grown up for a few hours. Mary didn't hesitate. She gave them each $2, about $11 in today's money, and a simple instruction: why don't you stop off and get some pizza? Kate, always the lighthearted one, joked about how much the price of a slice had gone up recently. Mary set a firm curfew: be back by 4 p.m. As the girls walked down the driveway, they were the picture of 1970s youth. Sheila was wearing a blue and white checkered coat. Kate was in a red sweater. They were walking into a bright spring afternoon, toward a mall that was the center of their social universe. Wheaton Plaza in 1975 was a labyrinth of consumer joy, but that afternoon, the shadows were already beginning to stretch across the corridors. The first shadow appeared around 1 p.m. A neighborhood boy, a friend of the sisters, noticed them sitting on a bench outside the Orange Bowl, a popular pizza and snack shop. They weren't alone. They were talking to a man who looked like he belonged in a corporate office rather than a mall on a Tuesday. He was between 50 and 60 years old, 6 feet tall, well-groomed, and dressed in a sharp brown suit. But it was what he was holding that caught everyone's eye. He had a briefcase, and inside that briefcase was a portable tape recorder. He held a microphone out to the girls and a group of other children. He told them he was a radio reporter, that he was recording their voices for a live broadcast. Think about the methodology here. This man chose a lure that was perfectly calibrated for the Lyon sisters. Their father was a radio star. The idea of being on the radio wasn't just exciting, it was familiar. It felt like home. Witnesses say the girls giggled as they spoke into the microphone. They trusted him because he represented the world their father belonged to. This man would later be nicknamed by investigators as Tape Recorder Man. But while the Tape Recorder Man was performing his high society act in front of the Orange Bowl, a second, much darker shadow was watching from the periphery. Danette Shea, a friend of the sisters who was slightly older than Sheila, was also at the mall that day. She later told detectives about a young man who made her skin crawl. He was in his late teens or early 20s, shabbily dressed, with long hair and a face deeply scarred by acne. He wasn't talking to anyone. He was just staring. Danette watched as this young man followed her and her friends, ogling them so intently that one of Danette's friends finally snapped. She turned to him and shouted, "Why don't you take a picture of us? It'll last longer." The young man didn't flinch. He just shifted his gaze. Danette noticed him leering at the Lyon sisters while they were still captivated by the man with the tape recorder. This was the younger suspect, and for decades, his composite sketch would be the one that sat in the bottom of a box, overshadowed by the more sophisticated Tape Recorder Man. At 2 p.m., a moment of profound heartbreak occurred. Jay Lyon, the girl's 15-year-old brother, entered the mall to buy a kite. As he walked past the Orange Bowl, he saw his sisters. They were sitting together, alone now, eating their pizza. Jay didn't stop to talk. They were just his little sisters, doing exactly what their mother had told them to do. He saw them safe, he saw them happy, and he kept walking. It is a moment Jay would likely replay in his mind for the rest of his life. The almost intervention. By 2:30 p.m., the girls began their walk home. They were seen by another friend, walking westward down the street, heading directly toward Pliers Mill Road. This is the final, verified sighting of Katherine and Sheila Lyon alive. They were within minutes of their front door. They were in their own neighborhood, and then they simply vanished. Back at the house, Mary Lyon was preparing a late afternoon meal of fried chicken. At 4 p.m., the house was quiet. No front door slamming, no giggling in the hallway. At 5:45 p.m., Mary started to feel that first prickle of annoyance. The "where are those girls" feeling. By 6:30 p.m., that annoyance had curdled into a cold, heavy dread. John Lyon, having just woken up for his night shift, joined the search. They hopped in the car, driving the route to the mall over and over, scanning the sidewalks, calling their names into the gathering twilight. They called the parents of the sisters' friends. No one had seen them since the mall. At 7 p.m., the Lyons did the one thing no parent ever wants to do. They picked up the phone and dialed the Montgomery County Police. The response was immediate and massive. Because John Lyon was a public figure, The case exploded into the media almost overnight, but as the police began their work, they realized they were already behind. They brought in the dogs. The hounds picked up a scent trail from the mall, leading toward the perimeter of a parking lot adjacent to a department store. The dogs strained at their leashes, tails wagging, following the girls' footsteps. And then, at the edge of the asphalt, the dogs stopped. They began to circle, confused. The scent was gone. To investigators, that scent break meant only one thing. This wasn't a case of two girls getting lost in the woods. This was the moment their feet left the ground. This was the moment they were put into a car. The investigation into the tape recorder man became an obsession for the department. They received over 300 tips in the first few days. They searched every vacant house, every storm sewer, and every vacant lot in Kensington. They even looked into the local tape recorder man sightings at other malls like Marlow Heights and Iverson Mall, where a similar man had been seen asking girls to record answering machine messages. But while the police were looking for a middle-aged man in a brown suit, the younger man, the one with the acne and the creepy stare, was doing something incredibly bold. On April 1st, just 1 week after the girls disappeared, that shabbily dressed young man walked right up to a mall security guard. He said his name was Lloyd Lee Welch Jr. He told the guard he had been at the mall on March 25th and that he had seen the tape recorder man. He was inserting himself into the investigation, acting as a helpful witness while the scent of the girls was still fresh in the air. The police took him to the station. They gave him a polygraph. He failed. The detectives, frustrated and overwhelmed by attention seekers, wrote "polygraph, lied" in big letters across his file and dismissed him. They thought he was just a troubled kid trying to be part of a big story. They didn't realize that the wolf wasn't just at the door. He was inside the station, telling them exactly where he had been. In the days following March 25th, 1975, the Lyon household on Pliers Mill Road didn't just become a crime scene. It became a fortress of desperate hope. John and Mary Lyon initiated a round-the-clock vigil. A family member was stationed by the phone every second of every day, terrified that the girls might call and find no one there. But the phone didn't bring the girls' voices. Instead, it brought the vultures. Within a week, the family and the police were besieged by hoaxers and extortionists. On April 4th, an anonymous man called John Lyon, demanding $10,000 for the girls' safe return. That's nearly $60,000 in today's money. John, desperate to do anything to see his daughters again, followed the caller's instructions to the letter. He packed a briefcase with cash and left it at a designated drop-off point, waiting in the shadows for a reunion that never came. The caller was eventually caught. He was just a small-time criminal looking to profit from a family's nightmare. He had no idea where the girls were. This was the cruelty of the Lyon case. For every real lead, there were 100 ghosts. However, while the police were sifting through hoaxes, 2 witness reports came in that should have changed everything. These weren't sightings at the mall. These were sightings of the sisters in transit, and the details are enough to make your blood run cold. The first came on April 6th from an 11-year-old boy named William Krebs in Centerville, Virginia. He told police he had seen 2 girls fitting the Lyon sisters' description inside a white, 2-door Pontiac sedan. He was adamant. He said the younger girl, who he identified as Katherine, was weeping. Beside her, another blonde girl sat in the rear passenger seat, silent and staring. But it was the report from the following day, April 7th, that remains one of the most chilling what-ifs in the entire case. A witness in Manassas, Virginia, about 50 minutes away from where the girls vanished, reported being stopped at a red light around 7:30 p.m. In front of him was a beige 1968 Ford station wagon with Maryland license plates. The witness looked into the rear window of the wagon, and his heart stopped. There, in the back of the car, were two young girls. They matched the description of Sheila and Katherine perfectly, but they weren't just sitting there. The witness claimed they were bound and gagged. He managed to write down part of the license plate, DMT-6. He was missing the final two numbers. He looked at the driver, noting that the man bore a striking resemblance to the composite sketch of the middle-aged tape recorder man that had been splashed across the evening news. As the witness tried to get closer to read the rest of the plate, the driver of the station wagon realized he was being watched. In a panic, the driver floored the accelerator, flew through the red light, and sped toward Interstate 66. By the time the witness could react, the beige wagon had disappeared into the flow of traffic. Think about that moment. The Lyon sisters were possibly right there, staring through a pane of glass at a world that couldn't reach them. The police flooded the Manassas area. They checked every combination of DMT-6 plates in the Maryland and Virginia registries. They searched for beige 1968 Fords until their eyes blurred, but the car and the girls seemed to have evaporated. By the summer of 1975, the long silence began to set in. The search and rescue dogs had been retired. The 122 National Guardsmen who had spent weeks scouring the Montgomery County forests had returned to their units. The lead investigator, Sergeant Chris Homrock, would later remark that the case hit a wall so thick it felt impenetrable. For the next 38 years, the Lyon case would be defined by its almosts. In 1982, investigators looked at Raymond Molesky Sr., a known child sex trafficker who walked with a limp, just like the tape recorder man. Molesky was already in prison, and he began taunting investigators, claiming he knew what happened to the girls. He told them they had been, quote, raped, killed, and burned, end quote. Police searched his former residence, digging up the yard, but found nothing. They looked at Thomas John Coffey, another predator who used metal detectors and fishing rods to lure children. Coffey had been in Montgomery County the week the girls vanished, but again, the evidence was circumstantial. There were no bodies, there was no crime scene. Decades passed. The 1970s gave way to the 80s, the 90s, and then the 2000s. In Kensington, a new generation of parents began taking their kids to Wheaton Plaza, most of them unaware of the two names that still haunted the police archives. John and Mary Lyon grew old. They reached their late 70s without ever knowing where their daughter's remains lay. They lived through nearly 14,000 days of silence, but in 2013, the silence was finally broken. It didn't happen with a dramatic confession or a sudden discovery of remains. It happened because Detective Chris Homrock decided to look at a 1977 mugshot of a man named Lloyd Lee Welch Jr. Welch had been arrested for a burglary just 8 blocks from the mall 2 years after the disappearance. Homrock looked at Welch's face, the pockmarks, the scar, the leering expression, and then he looked at the 1975 sketch of the younger suspect that had been ignored for decades. It was a near-perfect match. Homrock then found that dismissed report from April 1st, 1975, the one where Welch had tried to insert himself into the investigation. He realized that Welch hadn't been an attention seeker. He had been a participant, hiding in plain sight, using the tape recorder man as a shield to deflect attention from himself. The detectives realized they didn't need to find a ghost in a brown suit. They needed to find the man who had been staring at the girls from the shadows. And when they finally sat across from Lloyd Lee Welch Jr. in that Delaware prison cell, the long silence didn't just end, it shattered. The moment the girls slipped from the public eye of Wheaton Plaza, they entered a world that had been hidden behind the ordinary facade of a suburban home. Lloyd Lee Welch Jr. eventually confessed that he, his father Lloyd Sr., and his uncle Richard Dickey Welch were the conspirators who moved the sisters from the mall to the family residence in Hyattsville, Maryland, a house that, according to Welch's own testimony, contained a concrete dungeon-like basement, accessible only through a single, padlocked rear door. Inside that cellar, the girls were forced to spend the next several days, and possibly weeks, in a cramped, dark space that was never meant for habitation. Welch described the basement as, quote, dungeon-like, a term that later investigators used to underline the horror of the setting. The space was lit only by a single dim bulb and smelled of, quote, rotted ground beef, a grotesque cover story Welch offered when asked about the foul odor that later emanated from the bags he was seen carrying. Witnesses later corroborated that the basement was used for illicit sexual activity. In a later interview, Welch claimed that his father and uncle sexually abused one of the sisters inside that very room, and then, in a chilling turn, dismembered the other. He said he was forced at gunpoint to help clean the blood-splattered floor and to move the dismembered remains to a duffel bag. The claim that the girls were held for an extended period is supported by the indictment's timeline, which states the crimes may have occurred between March 25th and April 15th, 1975, giving the perpetrators up to 3 weeks to keep the victims alive before ending their lives. While the exact day-by-day events remain partially shrouded, a pattern emerges from Welch's later, more consistent statements. Day 1 and 2, the girls are forced into the backseat of a vehicle. Welch's own description of the girls being in the back of a car appears in witness testimonies that place them bound in a vehicle. Days 3 through 10, transported to Hyattsville, the sisters are held in the basement where they are repeatedly threatened, sexually assaulted, and forced to endure extreme confinement. Days 11 through 20, the abuse escalates. Welch alleges his uncle and father begin to physically mutilate one of the girls, a process he claims to have witnessed through a basement doorway. The psychological trauma inflicted during this captivity, the constant fear and sexual violation, cannot be overstated. The girls, once carefree teenagers, were reduced to terrified captives who knew that any attempt at escape would almost certainly result in death. Welch's statements on the actual killing are contradictory, but a core element emerges. The girls were murdered to prevent their identification and to silence them after the prolonged abuse. In his 2015 and 2017 interviews, Welch repeatedly claimed that the girls were abducted, raped, and burned. He insisted that the burning was a post-mortem act meant to destroy evidence, a claim reinforced by investigators who later found charred remnants of a beaded bracelet, a piece of jewelry known to belong to Katherine, in the soil of Taylor's Mountain. The indictment states that the girls, quote, were killed in order for their captors to escape detection, unquote. This phrase suggests a premeditated murder rather than an accidental killing. The motive, as prosecutors argued, was to eliminate witnesses who could connect the Welch family to the crime and to protect the family's illegal activities, which included a history of sexual offenses and a mobile carnival lifestyle that allowed them to move across state lines. In Welch's own words, after the alleged dismemberment of one sister, the bodies were placed inside two large army-style duffel bags, each, quote, weighing up to 70 pounds and smelling like death. He later claimed the bags were tossed into a fire that burned for several days, a story corroborated by his cousin, Henry Parker, who testified that the fire emitted a smell, quote, like burning flesh, unquote, and that the bags were indeed thrown into it. The presence of a charred wire believed to be from Sheila's glasses and the bead fragments recovered from the same site further substantiate the claim that a fire was used to destroy physical evidence. The method of murder, whether by strangulation, blunt force, or another means, has never been definitively proven because the bodies were never recovered. However, forensic experts who examined the alleged crime scene concluded that the girls likely died from asphyxiation or blunt force trauma before being burned, because the fire alone would not have been sufficient to reduce two teenage bodies to ash without first causing death. The final chapter of the girls' tragic story takes place on a remote ridge in Bedford County, Virginia, known locally as Taylor's Mountain. The Welch family owned a parcel of land there, a family-owned farm that provided the perfect cover for a clandestine burial. According to Welch's own confession, after the girls were placed in duffel bags, he carried the bags to the property and buried the bodies on the land. He later altered his story, claiming instead that the bags were tossed into a fire that burned for several days, a claim that matches the testimony of Henry Parker and Connie Ackers, who both recall Welch arriving with, quote, bloody bags and a pungent rotten ground beef smell, end quote, that later turned out to be the smell of burning human remains. The physical evidence recovered from the site decades later underscores the veracity of this narrative. In a forensic dig conducted in September 2014, investigators uncovered small degraded bone fragments of human origin, a single human tooth, later lost before it could be examined, a section of charred wire believed to be from Sheila's wired-rimmed glasses, and remnants of a beaded bracelet similar to the one Katherine habitually wore. These artifacts were found exactly where the 2014 and 2017 search warrants directed investigators to look, confirming that the fire had indeed taken place on the property and that the remains had been partially reduced to ash and fragmented bone. Despite these finds, the majority of the girls' remains remain missing, although it is likely that they are no more than bone fragments. The forensic evidence was too degraded for DNA analysis, and the recovered tooth vanished before it could be tested. The FBI's evidence recovery team has repeatedly emphasized that the lack of a complete skeleton prevents a traditional body-in-the-grave prosecution, but the physical clues were sufficient to support the prosecution's theory that the bodies were burned and partially scattered on the mountain. The new evidence, referenced in a 2024 Washington Post article, later confirmed by the U.S. Marshals Service, prompted a renewed search of the mountain, but no additional remains have surfaced to date. The case therefore remains one of the most infamous no-body convictions in American legal history. In the immediate aftermath of the disappearance, detectives focused on the tape recorder man, the middle-aged individual in the brown suit who had been seen speaking into a microphone. A composite sketch of that man was widely circulated, but no arrests were made. Meanwhile, the younger suspect, the leering teenager, was rendered in a second sketch that never received the same level of public exposure. The case went cold, and for decades, the Lyon family received countless hoax calls, ransom demands, and dead-end leads. Even high-profile suspects, such as Raymond Molesky Sr., a known child sex trafficker, were investigated but never linked to the murders beyond speculation. In 2012, Montgomery County Police created a cold case unit that revisited old files with fresh eyes. Detective Chris Homrock, while reviewing the massive archive, stumbled upon a 1975 police report that mentioned an 18-year-old named Lloyd Lee Welch who had approached a security guard at the mall shortly after the disappearance, claiming to have seen a man abduct the girls. The report also included a mugshot of Welch from a 1977 burglary, which bore an uncanny resemblance to the second sketch of the leering teenager. Homrock's team obtained a search warrant for the Hyattsville residence and the Taylor's Mountain property. The warrant uncovered blood-stained concrete in the basement, a large, rust-stained duffel bag, and charred debris consistent with the sisters' alleged disposal method. When Homrock and his partners traveled to Delaware to interview the incarcerated Welch, the suspect gave them 8 hours of testimony, the longest interrogation in the case's history. Welch's initial statements were riddled with lies. He repeatedly failed polygraph tests and shifted blame onto Raymond Bolesky. However, as detectives pressed, a pattern emerged. He admitted to being at the mall on the day of the disappearance. He described the concrete basement in Hyattsville and the dismemberment he allegedly witnessed. These statements, though still contradictory in details, align closely with the physical evidence recovered from both locations. In July 2015, Bedford County prosecutors, led by Commonwealth Attorney Randy Krantz, formally indicted Lloyd Lee Welch Jr. on 2 counts of first-degree felony murder. The indictment specifically stated that the crimes occurred between March 25th and April 15th, 1975, acknowledging the 3-week captivity window. During the sentencing hearing, Bedford County Sheriff Mike Brown explained that the sisters were likely killed to prevent detection and that the burning of their remains was a deliberate act to obliterate evidence. Prosecutor Wes Nance later remarked, "We think what the investigators did was unprecedented," and emphasized that the conviction represented an extraordinary step for a case that had remained unsolved for 4 decades. After his conviction, Welch was transferred from a Delaware prison to the Virginia Department of Corrections in January 2025 to begin serving his sentence for the Lyon sisters' murders. He remains incarcerated at the Nottoway Correctional Center, where he will likely spend the rest of his life, given the length of the sentence and his age. The Lyon sisters case is now one of the longest-running no-body murder convictions in U.S. history. It demonstrates that circumstantial and forensic evidence, when combined with a credible confession, even a partial one, can overcome the traditional requirement of a body. Together, the individual strands created a coherent, prosecutable theory that convinced a jury to convict a man who had spent nearly 4 decades evading justice. The story of Sheila and Katherine Lyon is a portrait of sustained investigative perseverance, a stark reminder that time does not erase the truth. From the bright, ordinary afternoon at Wheaton Plaza, through the darkness of a concrete basement, to the cold, remote slopes of Taylor's Mountain, the sisters' journey ended in a tragedy that the world only began to understand decades later. For the Lyon family, the conviction provides a measure of legal closure, though the physical absence of their daughters remains a wound that may never fully heal. For law enforcement, it is a case study in the power of re-examining old evidence, leveraging new forensic techniques, and persistently pursuing leads no matter how long the silence endures. "We just want to know what happened to our daughters," Mary Lyon told investigators in 2017. The answer, though incomplete, now rests in the court record. They were abducted, held captive, murdered, and their bodies burned on a mountain in Virginia. A grim conclusion that finally allowed a community to say, "Justice at last has been served." This podcast is written and hosted by me, Shay, and edited by my husband, Toby. Give us a like and follow, and leave a review. It really helps weirdos like me to keep researching even weirder cases like this. This has been the Evidence Locker. I'll see you next time. Stay curious, stay safe. Join us next week as we open another locker.